I'll be the first to admit that in my discussions about the Russo-Ukraine war, I've spent a lot more time focusing on the nonsense within the pro-Ukraine side. That is, the denial of reality, the absurd things that are being said, the moral failings of it, the contradictions, and that sort of thing. The major reason for that is because I live in the West, and probably 90 to 95% of media I am exposed to, ranging from people talking around the water cooler to national news, ranges from being moderately to fanatically pro Ukraine, often hysterically talking about how Putin's killing like tens of millions of Ukrainians, how he's the next Hitler, how Ukraine is winning the war, but they also need all our money because they're losing the war, and just it'll just go on to absurd degrees. And I've covered some of these articles in the past of how the war is going that are in clear defiance of observable reality. The fact, at least from my perspective, is most pro Russian sources have either been banned, sidelined, or people are afraid to even talk about the conflict from a neutral perspective because of the immense social consequences of doing so. Now, you are starting to see some people in the US who are raising the question within the Republican Party, maybe we're spending too much money on this. Is this really in America's self interest? Is if the Ukraine really has no real way of winning this war, what are we even doing? That all being said, I just want to talk about maybe some of the issues I have or problems with some of the narratives that come out of the pro Russia side. So, firstly, I think it has to be understood that a lot of this, whenever it comes down to America versus China or any country versus America, there's a substantial number of people who just hate America for one reason or another, ranging from the fact that their political ideological agendas incompatible with American hegemony, if there's some sort of economic reason, perhaps America prevents them from doing something in international affairs. But there's often a spurious variable involved in a lot of people who go against America in a particular conflict, where the actual details don't really matter. Who the party America's up against doesn't matter. They just hate the US and they will always take the side of whoever's against them. And I find an aspect of this is they will often put a lot of the anti-US countries in the same basket. Like they'll say, oh, Russia's the same as Venezuela, that's the same as Cuba, that's the same as China, and these circumstances are all the same. I know I see this a lot with the whole Taiwan thing, and it being exactly the same as the Ukraine situation. And I just kind of wish people would be honest about this and they just say, look, regardless of my feelings on this particular circumstance, I just hate America in general. And so it doesn't particularly matter. And I think some people are honest about that, but I also think a lot of this feeds into my next point, which is the complaining about international law, that America is breaking international law, they're violating international treaties, all that kind of thing. And that leads into like American imperialism and neocolonialism and all these kind of moral arguments against the US. And my issue is a lot of these are just very selectively applied. And they're unwilling, I think, in a lot of cases to get into questions of good versus evil, maybe because they're secular or they don't want to show their hand, as it were. But they'll complain about America violating international law. They'll complain about the global American empire. But they will shill for China and they'll say, oh, China's doing is altruistic or China's not as bad or China doesn't try to exploit other countries in the same way. And if they had the military position the US is in, they wouldn't act in exactly the same way, but they would definitely like we have this pretense that China is like this altruistic power that's isolationist that doesn't want any kind of imperial control, and maybe even if they don't necessarily want to take over countries or occupy them or whatever, they definitely have economic interests. Likewise, a lot of this seems to ignore like what happened during the Cold War. where you did have communist movements all across the world. If you look at the number of countries that went communist or almost went communist, or where there was active civil wars going on, it was a large proportion of the globe. You did have two imperial powers that were struggling against each other for global domination. And if you want to take the perspective that it doesn't really matter what the two powers stand for or what the morals or the ideology of the situation is, and that imperialism itself is evil, then you have to say the same applies to China. China is just less successful at it and has less of an opportunity to do it. It also applies to Russia. I don't really see how you can make the argument that it doesn't, regardless of what its current incarnation is. And Russia is an imperialist power. We can pretend that it's not, but it does have a belief that there is a sphere of influence of parts that used to of countries that used to be part of the Russian Empire or used to be part of the Soviet Union that Russia has a claim to, either to indirectly control, to be in some sort of federation with, or to directly annex. And there's a variety of different claims they have to do this, ranging from large Russian populations within the countries that act as a fifth column to historical claims, etc. So, is Russia a revanchist imperialist power that wants to retake land that it feels it's lost? I mean, yeah, I don't think that's arguable. And I don't like when people are like, oh, it's Russia's this like poor country where it's a good boy and it never did nothing. Now, once again, you can support this agenda. You can say, yes, Russia has a completely legitimate right to retake these territories. But I don't really get how you can say Russia isn't an imperialist power. The most you can really say is that Russia just isn't as successful at it as the US is at this particular point in time. I just mean you can't have it both ways. You can't bitch about the US invading Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, and then when Russia starts civil wars or invades countries, say, oh, that's perfectly okay. From a legal perspective, I mean. From a moral perspective, maybe not. Like I said, you can argue that the invasion of Iraq to impose democracy is not morally the same as Russia invading Ukraine to ostensibly protect Russian citizens. But from a purely legal perspective, if we're going to start whining about world court decisions and suddenly we care about what the UN's saying, like, because you'll get this weird double think. You'll get people who are like, oh, the UN, particularly like right wing people, oh, the UN supports all this global degeneracy, but I suddenly respect the UN and their legal code now that America is doing something against Russia, but the legal code doesn't apply to. It's just, I just find it very selectively enforced, and I just find it very obnoxious in a lot of cases. And so that brings us to the war itself. The idea that this is not an invasion, this is not a war, that this is a special military operation, as if that's anything other than like a big troll from Putin. I'm not sure how many people actually believe that. It irritates me when people refer to it that way because if anything like in history is an invasion of another country, this is. Once again, you can say that this is moral, you can say that this is justified. I might even agree with you. But to pretend that this isn't a war, it's like saying Vietnam was a police action or Korea was a police action. It's very clearly a war, it's very clearly an invasion. It's very clearly Russia's attempt to impose its will on another country through the use of force. And in particular, the thing I find the most obnoxious about this is the arguments that. So you can argue that Ukraine is a nonsensical country, that it shouldn't exist, that its borders are a leftover from the Soviet era, from purely administrative circumstances, and when it gained independence, it should not look the way it does. But the reality is, the government of Ukraine, be it the previous one or the current one, recognizes certain borders. And if Russia invades it and occupies part of the country that they consider its legal territory, the idea that Ukraine is committing some sort of war crime or act of aggression by attempting to retake territories that it views as being part of its state, just seems absurd to me. I mean, isn't that kind of the entire basis of Russia's position? That these territories are being occupied by a foreign power, in this case, Ukraine, and so they have a right to retake them. Like, I know at the start of the current special military occupation, the reasons that were given is that Ukraine was committing acts of aggression. They were trying to retake territory they considered legally theirs that was occupied by a foreign power. And it's like people will cry crocodile tears about this all the time, about the poor population of Lushansk and the Donbass republics. But at the end of the day, to the Ukrainian government, it is a legal part of their territory. Russia was occupying it. And the area that they considered part of their country did unilaterally decide to declare independence and leave without the central government's approval, which is ironically how the Soviet Union broke up. So it's just the pretense that this entire war is just a blatant act of aggression by Ukraine, and Russia was a good boy who didn't do nothing, and Russia didn't have any imperialist designs on Ukraine before 2014. It's obviously not the case. And I mean, once again, you could argue that Ukraine is part of Russia. You can argue that Ukraine is within Russia's sphere of influence under the principle of realpolitik. I just don't like it when people do the whole cries out in pain as he strikes you thing. Like, you invade Ukraine and occupy some of the territory, and when they shoot back at you, you like grab your leg and roll on the ground screaming that it was unjustified. I mean, this is something that all kinds of different governments in the West and throughout the world do. And I always hate it. It's like, a recent example was America was like, the Taliban better not attack us as we're withdrawing from the country, even as we're shooting at them. I recall that also being the case in Syria, where they might attack the Syrian government. And if the Syrian government was to shoot back at them, they would be like, that would be an act of aggression. I just find that the case in a lot of these wars where the stronger power will invade, and if people shoot back at them, it'll be an act of aggression or an act of war or something, as if invading the country isn't an act of war. On that note, let's get into the whole conception of the legitimacy of Zelensky's regime. So, as we all know, the government of Russia, the pro-Russian government of Russia, was overthrown in 2014 in Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, and in which case a pro-Europe, pro-US government was installed that immediately banned all the pro-Russian political parties. Now, let's not pretend that elections were 100% legitimate in the Ukraine with no problems prior to 2014, but now they like suddenly aren't after that. I mean, Ukraine's kind of been a disaster since it became an independent country. It's always been fractious, it's always been unstable. So like, to pretend that there was no, like, it's this narrative that there was like no election fraud or no major election fraud prior to it, that it was like completely legitimate. I mean, it's just a country where there's like constant stuff like that going on. The fact that it got worse, and it got obviously worse, doesn't necessarily mean that it was great before. So yeah, it was a colored revolution. The CIA and the US was involved, but it's not as if no one in the Ukraine didn't want a pro-Western government. It's not as if there is a substantial portion of the population that is pro-Europe and anti-Russia, specifically in the western half of the country. I'd imagine parts of the country, especially in the West, where there's like 90% of the population who's anti-Russia, who wants to be part of Europe, who doesn't have any sympathy for Russian revanchism. So while we can say that the government of Zelensky is imposed by the West, and it certainly is, it's not as if there is not substantial support for it among at least part of the Ukrainian population. And so this gets to kind of the unsolvable problem where the two halves of the country have unreconcilable interests, in which case you should probably have some form of partition. But let's not pretend that a pro-Russian government would represent the interests of all of the country, nor would a pro-Western government represent the interests of all of the country. It's not as if none of the Ukrainian people um, support Zelensky and support the act of resistance. And that's another like argument I hear a lot is that like Zelensky is bad for resisting the invasion of a foreign power. Once again, you can view his regime as being illegitimate and you can view Russia as being in the right. But like the idea that Ukraine is somehow wrong to shoot back when someone's rolling tanks across their borders, it's just really fake and really Giesler. And I just kind of hate that in general. And then there's the argument that I've seen a lot, and this gets into the whole like prudence versus morality versus legality versus reality thing, where, well, Ukraine's obviously losing the war, so they should just give up and not continue struggling. And I mean, there's been lots of cases in history, like the American Revolution, like the Civil War. I mean, should like should the Confederacy have just not tried because the odds were against them? Should they just have given up on their dream of nationhood and just kind of rolled over to whatever the North wanted? You could argue, yes, you could argue that there isn't any virtue in resistance in the case of inevitability, that it's better to just not resist and not have your country completely and totally destroyed if there's more or less a 0% chance of victory. I mean, and we could even talk about Serbia, like was like this in World War One, where they put up a truly heroic resistance. They eventually collapsed, but they suffered immense casualties. They drove the Austro-Hungarians out multiple times. I think something like 25% of their adult male population died. So on one hand, is that heroic? Is that a symbol of patriotism and self-sacrifice? Yes, but if we're applying the same logic, we could also say it was foolish. There was no way that Serbia was ever going to resist the combined onslaught of the Central Powers, and them attempting to just led to their country being reduced to a smoking ruin. As with all of these things, I don't think it can really be applied consistently. I think you have to look at each individual circumstance. But I do kind of take issue with the idea that Zelensky is inherently evil and the Ukrainian government is inherently evil because they're actively fighting another country that's invading them. And this also kind of gets into like the other one I see is that like Russia is just trying to protect the people of Ukraine from like a foreign regime, that they're this like benevolent power once again who didn't do nothing. War is an extremely brutal, horrific um, occurrence, especially in situations like this where you have industrial warfare and wars of attrition. Ultimately, you can argue whether or not it's strategically important, but it's unarguable Russia's been destroying Ukraine's infrastructure with cruise missiles and bombings. That they've been taking out the power grid, the water grid, the gas grid in the middle of a very cold winter, and that is imposing a large degree of suffering on the Ukrainian people, and that their warfare is destroying a lot of the regions that they claim to be there to protect. And you can argue the amount of damage that they're going to wind up doing to the various regions that they've incorporated into Russia, which once again like is part of the whole fake and Giesler thing, where it's like, okay, well these parts of Ukraine are part of our country now, and Ukraine is invading Russian territory because we seized part of their country and declared it part of Russia, and their government still legally considers it to be part of the Ukraine. How dare they try to defend what they see as their legal territory? And once again, this is like the whole victim complex, where it's like, and it's kind of funny because there's a channel I really like, the Duran, and they brought on Noam Chomsky, ironically enough. And I will say, see people who sometimes will are like very conservative or very right wing, and they'll side with like Noam Chomsky or other people on the far left because they hate America too. And it's kind of ironic because like part of Noam Chomsky's entire thing is that America is the only country on earth that has any kind of agency. It is the only country that's able is able to act in its own self-interest or to act in a cruel or evil fashion. That this does not apply to anybody else. And I find that's often what you get. Now, I want to move on, and this is the most pathetic, I think lame, fake and Giesler aspect of the whole thing. The whole neo Nazi thing. I will say, Putin saying he wants to denazify Ukraine is one of the greatest trolls of all time. Because it did force the Western media to report it, and it did very much confuse the issue. But the idea that Ukraine is some sort of neo Nazi state is absurd with its Jewish leader, with its like pro West, pro gay, pro internationalist agenda. The whole like also a lot of these people who support Ukraine are fascists, are neo Nazis. So we have this bizarre scenario where we have these like people who are like Heil Hitler. I'm not saying this is a majority, even a lot, but you have people who say that they'll be like, Russia's right because Ukraine's a Nazi country, and Ukraine is run on the principles of National Socialism. And a lot of these people will complain that everybody who's like to the right of Obama is called a Nazi, but they'll jump on board this. And the justification they'll give is like the Azov battalion. And like, yes, they are a neo-Nazi group. Do they represent the entirety of the Ukrainian state? No. But you get this thing where like they'll find something where somebody drew a swastika and they'll be like, see, the Ukraine is a neo-Nazi state and we have to defascify it. And I know like the most cringe thing is when they decided to send the leopards to Ukraine. Putin, I think Putin said this, but a lot of the Russians were like, we're going to be fighting German tanks named after big cats again. Ma World War II. Ma 11, however million Russians died in World War II. It's just like that. Yeah, we're the aggressor. Yeah, we're invading another country and they're getting weaponry to fight back against us. But the like neoliberal socialist ultra pro immigration government of Germany is somehow a neo Nazi state. Ukraine's a neo Nazi state. I remember the whole like the 1488 tanks, like the 14 Leopard 2s and the 88 Leopard 1s. Now, I don't know if that was a coincidence or if that was a troll, but that was pretty funny, I'm going to be honest. But like the idea that the modern German government is a neo-Nazi state, the EU is some sort of like Fourth Reich. I know I make that joke from time to time. That Zelensky's regime is like led by the Jew, is Hitler reborn. It's just retarded. Like it's just such crocodile tears and it's such bitching and it's such Russia wanting to play the victim in a war that they started. Once again, you can say the war is just or unjust, but it's pretty clear who militarily started this whole thing and who is actively invading another country. Also, if we want to go to World War II, like, are we supposed to feel sorry for Stalinist Russia? Are we supposed to think like the leader of global communism at the time is like some awesome country that we should idolize and fetishize? That like Stalin was this amazing dude? I don't know, especially when it comes to the whole neo-Nazi thing. It's just a bunch of crocodile tears. So, those are some thoughts on it. I hope they were fairly coherent and weren't just too strange. God bless everybody. I'll talk to you all real soon.